some people were like, John, why are you doing Charles Dickens? Why are you doing A Christmas Carol? And one of the reasons why we did this is because, number one, it is so common in our culture today. So A Christmas Carol is one of those things that just about everybody in the United States knows about, has seen it maybe 10, 20, 30 times, who knows. It is not 18th century, but it does give us this window into the 19th century and early 19th century at that, which is a direct outworking of what's going on in the 18th century. So it helps us illuminate the world that the 18th century turned into. And there are specific things that are happening in the 18th century that make the world that Charles Dickens was writing about happen. And it's important for us to understand what was going on. It's like we can study the 18th century all day long, but if we don't understand what went on there and then what it turned into, well, then this isn't really helpful to us. We have to know where the 18th century came from, what happened in the 18th century, and then what did they do wrong and what did they do right that made the 19th century what it was. And so
in this case, the ramifications of what came out of the 18th century is right here in this book. Right,
and the bad ramifications. Really, this is like one of those, the story of, the moral of the story is, right? This is a very moralistic story, and he's talking about things that are happening in English society, and, to some extent, what's happening happening everywhere. But he's trying to change something on purpose. It isn't just hey, this is a fun story.
No.
We might look at it that way today, but he was very, very specific about that. Let's start with Charles Dickens.
Okay.
Tell me about Charles Dickens.
Well, we know already, most of us that have ever looked into Charles Dickens, that he was born in 1812. He was born the oldest son in the family. His father, John, was a naval pay clerk. So he worked at the naval yards handing out the pay for that. And he had some younger siblings that we won't go into. But his father, even though he handled money for the naval offices, was not really good at handling money of his own. And so the family was constantly in debt. And because of 1812, when Charles was born, it wasn't long before the war was over. And when you don't have that many people in the Navy anymore, or you don't need a Navy anymore, your jobs kind of plunge. And so John Dickens got moved a couple of times through Charles's younger years. And he began to struggle a lot more with his debt and with his money. And so ended up with a situation when Charles was 12 where John Dickens was actually put in debtor's prison. And of course, debtor prison at this period of time, if you didn't have a way to survive, if you were the wife and children left behind, you got to go to debtor's prison too. So the whole family went into debtor's prison except for one older sister who remained in school, and Charles, who at 12 years old was considered old enough to work. And he was sent into a blacking factory. His job was to put glue on the back of the labels and stick them on the jars that the blacking was being sold of. And for that, he got 6 pence a week.
A week?
A week, which is just almost nothing at all. But yet, that was what he did in order to be able to help with the family. He wasn't in there a really long period of time. His father was able to settle his debts and get back out. But his mother wanted him to stay. She wanted him, in fact, she negotiated with the owner of the factory to try to get Charles back into working in the blacking factory and to have to stay there. And he never forgave his mom for that. I mean, there's nothing like not being wanted, right?
And in a blacking factory.
In a blacking factory, a horrible, horrible situation.
They're working with lamp black, and it's the finest black powder in the world. It gets on everything.
That's
and
right.
the minute you try to wash your hands,
it just
all
spreads.
Yeah.
And they
terrible.
were living there too.
Right.
This is a residential factory,
Yeah,
so
breathing
you're
it
there
in.
all day long.
Yeah.
And sleeping upstairs somewhere on a bed of straw if you were lucky enough to have that. It was broken into groups where you had an older boy that took care of the younger boys. And there was some abuse that went on that we know of through that period of time. Charles never talked about it a whole lot. He only mentioned it to a friend of his a couple of times, but it was something that he kept inside of him quite a bit. But
and very common throughout that.
Oh yes, very common through that period of time. But it's interesting that he ended up putting some everybody like that in every single book that he wrote. If you look, every book that Charles Dickens is an author of always has a small child, usually a boy, that is abandoned by everyone else, who is in a horrible, nasty position, struggling to get out in some way, unloved, unwanted, unneeded. So this is a reflection of himself, and we'll see him in A Christmas Carol if you haven't found him already. He is able to come out. His father puts him back in school, and he finishes out his life and begins to write as he gets a little bit older, writing periodicals for magazines, little short pieces. He actually one time was asked to write captions for a magazine that was going to be put out that was going to be just drawings. And they needed someone to put little short, cute captions underneath it. And he said, why don't, instead of we doing that, why don't I write a story to go along with the pictures, and you put the pictures into the story, and we'll just do one a month. We'll do like a chapter a month, and people, it will increase the periodicals, and people will buy it more. And they said, are you sure that that's what will happen? And he goes, if it doesn't, then I'll quit and do what you want. So that's how he got into doing that, started writing under the name Boz, B-O-Z, was the way that he wrote. But he started that periodical writing like that, doing a chapter at a time. It made it cheap enough that everybody could buy it instead of writing a whole novel and trying to sell it, and actually set the stage for several of the books that he wrote for that.
Are they like picture books with mostly picture and half text, or do you have a feel for that?
They're more text with a picture or two to go with it, I think.
So sort of even like
something along that line. He was the first person to come up, the people that he talked to about whether or not to do this periodical, doing one chapter, they were like, well, what's going to make people want to buy the next month? What you're going to write this little piece of the book and put a couple of pictures in there. What makes them want to write the next month? And he comes up with a word. He says, I tell you what, we'll always have the protagonist, the main character, hanging onto their fingernails off the edge of a cliff at the end of this first, whatever we're writing. We'll leave them dangling so that it'll make them want to buy the next one. And he's the one that actually came up with the cliffhanger and the word cliffhanger. And that's where we get that, is from him. His idea to keep things going.
Why did you do it to us?
So we can all be mad at him when we get to those points. He was the first one, though, to use a child as a protagonist. Nobody in the novel writing had ever used a child as the main star. But Charles Dickens had a heart for children, a real strong heart for children, and in particular, because of his background, poor children. And that's what really motivated him. And you see that again circling in all of his books. You have these poor children that are set in these instances that they cannot get out of.
So he's like reworking his childhood through all these stories.
He is.
How do I go back and save myself in these stories?
Yeah. What could I? Or here, look at me. This is what happened to me. And you should feel sorry for me. And he was really good at that. He was really good at tearing our heartstrings out. I mean, like with Oliver Twist, if you've had a chance to see or read that, that's a heart tugger. And the children that are, not only Oliver Twist, but the children that are with Fagin, that are in the pickpocketing gang and stuff like that, and you see what little derelicts they are and where they've come from. It's very moving. And he continued to build on that.
And I think, and one of the things we're talking about here is the fact that he's not writing, he's not like making up big stories, things that weren't happening. This is everyday stuff.
Right. He was a social activist, and he was particularly incensed about the Industrial Revolution. He did not like the ramifications that had come from the Industrial Revolution, and he didn't like the people that were being hurt by it. Not that he had anything against the positive part of it, but he didn't care for what it was doing to the poor. And he was very much an activist in that area. And the thing that angered him the most was that the upper classes, which were the rich or the wealthy class, and even the middling class was very close up there at this period of time, that there was such a gap down to the poor, and they really didn't care.